Hello and welcome to UPLINK TV's Retro Game History Series. I'm Brendan Bailey.
And I'm Mike Staub, and we're talking about Generation 4.
Generation 4,
which is,
let's do it.
I don't know, it's the 90s, it's the late 80s, it's the early 90s, you know, it's our childhood.
It's when we were kids.
Yes!
So that's why we're doing this one. I mean, like, I'm assuming that a lot of our friends were kids and had these consoles, and we'll know some of the things that we're talking about, and of course we're going to explore some maybe more obscure consoles that are on the table and talk to you about everything that came out in the fourth generation of video game consoles.
I think this might be my favorite generation of video game consoles, but don't tell the others because I want them to think that I love them too. So, first and foremost, we want to start, and this console generation gets itself started in 1989, all the way back in 1989 with the Sega Genesis, or the Sega Genesis, which was the first 16-bit console on the market.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. I mean, the Sega Genesis is one of my favorite consoles, and here it is. This is the first version of the Genesis.
Yeah, the Gen 1. Look at these cards, man.
The Sega Genesis came in many different forms and factors, and had many different peripherals and add-ons and that sort of thing. You may be familiar with the book Console Wars, which is a great retelling of the competition between the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. The Sega Genesis was first on the scene and beat the Super Nintendo to market by about 2 years, and really was the first video game console to give Nintendo a run for their money. I mean, Nintendo was sort of dominating everything that was happening in the video game industry, and finally Sega Genesis came out and gave them a run for their money. And the Genesis was really built as an upgrade. Originally was kind of slated as an upgrade for the Sega Master System, and Sega just kept adding parts onto what the Master System was, you know, better sounds, better graphics, faster processing, and eventually the Sega Genesis was born. The Sega Genesis had a Motorola 68000 processor in it, which for you processor geeks out there was one of the most famous computer processors of the 80s and one of the fastest. And for Sega to put that chip in this system was a big deal, something that they ended up marketing as blast processing, which is kind of one of those famous things that everybody talks about when we talk about the marketing of the Genesis. And blast processing doesn't actually mean anything. They just sort of made it up, but they were referring to the fast processing of the 68000.
Marketing
chip.
does go a long way, especially when you're marketing the Sega Genesis to kids who might have been, you know, pre-teens or younger than teens with the Nintendo, and jumping into the next generation, they wanted to play something that might have been a little bit more geared towards their teenage, radical Bart Simpson, Sonic the Hedgehog tastes. And the Sega Genesis was kind of that console. It was like the bad boy console. It had Sonic the Hedgehog, who had a rotten attitude, and he was fast, to represent exactly what the console wanted to do, was to be fast and powerful and bright and have an excellent sound design on this console. And it was one of the first consoles that really sought to bring the arcade experience home. The Genesis was about playing fast and powerful and bringing games like Altered Beast, right? That were big arcade hits at the time, bringing that home and allowing you to play something similar to the arcade experience on a home console.
Altered Beast was actually the original pack-in game with the Genesis. If you bought the Genesis, you got that game with it. A lot of people think that Sonic the Hedgehog was kind of like the big debut game for the Genesis, but they didn't start packing in Sonic the Hedgehog until later. Originally, it was Altered Beast, and the Genesis really was about more high-quality arcade ports rather than original games. And then that sort of shifted when Sonic came out and became Sega's, new mascot.
Yeah, Sonic was like the reason to get a Genesis. I remember playing hours upon hours of Sonic the Hedgehogs, 1, 2, 3, and it always felt like it was cutting itself a little different from what Nintendo was doing with the Mario games, but we can get into Nintendo in just a little bit. But the Sega Genesis was something remarkable at the time. It was something that Nintendo was a bit of a monolith. It was almost foolhardy, right, to challenge them in that market, and Sega did, and actually did a really good job of, like you said, giving them a run for their money for most of the generation.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about the console war when we get to the Super Nintendo, and we'll also talk about some of the upgraded peripherals that came out for the Sega Genesis as time went along in the 4th generation.
Yeah, I think we're almost at a full Voltron over here.
Yeah.
So back here at the back of the table.
Wanting to discuss. When it comes to the Sega Genesis nowadays, you can still get one of these, of course. I mean, these systems were built remarkably well, and most of them still work. There are modifications available for doing different video outputs. So if you don't necessarily have an old TV or you're worried about input lag, there are video mods you can do. I believe since the Genesis is putting out an RGB signal, there's a lot of RGB mods that you can do to get like some pretty incredible video signal out of it. Especially these earlier Genesis systems, which have better sound, and this particular model has a headphone jack in the front that actually outputs stereo sound, whereas the audio coming out of the back is actually only in mono. So you can get stereo sound if you use that headphone jack. It's a little known trick that some of the audio video nut jobs out there like me will go ahead and actually route a cable from the front rather than from the back for the audio.
Well, you got to get that FM synth in stereo, right? I mean, there's something special about a console that has a fader on the front of it. Like, come on, we're not messing around here. You know, the audio guys are like, yeah, turn it up, crank that fader up.
So the Sega Genesis has just been reborn in the form of the Sega Genesis Classic, or I guess the Sega Genesis Mini.
It's a beautiful little mini console if you want to play some of those games on a modern TV with a HDMI output. As someone who likes to stream video games directly to the internet, it's a great option for folks like me who want to just plug it into an Elgato device and stream video games to the internet. Also, these games are kind of everywhere. You can get a lot of great Genesis games on any digital storefront. I know a lot of the new consoles now have access to them through some sort of digital collection. There's a bunch of Genesis collections out there. So if you don't have the ability to get your hands on an actual Genesis, there's definitely ways to play those games. So if you want to experience what gaming was like in 1989 and the early to mid 90s, definitely try to get your hands on some of that stuff. And I really suggest getting some games like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 especially. But even some more great arcade ports. There's some great shooters on the Genesis, as well as a decent port of Street Fighter 2.
Yeah, a lot of action games on the Genesis.
Yeah, a lot of action games.
It was more of again, fast-paced, kind of exciting games was what Genesis was really bringing to the table.
So what's your favorite Genesis game?
Oh, I'll have to get back to you on that. I love Dynamite Headdy.
I knew where it was
Dynamite
going.
Headdy was going to come out. Dynamite Headdy is one of my I guess hidden gems, as they like to call it. But yeah, Ristar was one of the later games. It was great. I mean, obviously Sonic is classic. I'd go Dynamite Headdy.
Dynamite Headdy.
Dynamite
Headdy.
So
that's a good pick.
So that was kind of like one of the greatest consoles you could get, but if you wanted to have something a little cheaper, you could go ahead and get one of these Tiger handhelds.
1989, the Tiger handhelds.
And
wow.
I'll admit, I had a bunch of these because who didn't as a kid? I mean, I felt like these things were everywhere. I felt like my friends had at least one of these.
I felt like anywhere you went, whether it was the supermarket, drugstore, KB Toys, anything, you would fall into about 1,000 Tiger electronic handhelds. I feel like everyone had about a dozen of them, and they cover such a wide array of properties here. I mean, there's a basketball one here that's just simply called Basketball, but then you have Paperboy, which is a famous arcade game, and later
they clearly licensed some pretty good games. Yeah. I mean, you got Mega Man 2.
Mega Man 2?
I had the Sonic the Hedgehog one when I was a kid, I remember playing it constantly.
Yeah.
Nowadays you pick these things up and you're like, you need a lot of imagination to enjoy the games, but back in the day, I remember playing these Tiger handhelds and legitimately playing them and trying to get the high score and really sitting there for a long time and just playing them.
I'll tell you, motion sickness in the back of a car never feels good, but it almost felt worth it if you're playing a Tiger electronic game. So I've used these on many road trips as a kid, and I don't have any of them anymore, but they were definitely a special part of the 90s gaming experience. And as we move on through the end of the 80s here and almost into the 90s, I think it's time to unbox our friend over there. Let's give a little there we go. Whew. That's a unit. That is the Turbografx 16 with some of the additional add-ons like the Turbografx Cd, which the Turbografx 16 released in the United States in 1989, as designed by Hudson Soft and NEC.
Yes, it started off as the PC Engine
in Japan.
In Japan.
And for those of you who watch High Score Girl, they talk a lot about this console. So Brendan, why don't you tell us a little bit about what this thing does?
So the Turbografx 16 is sort of like the forgotten 16-bit console. It's admittedly not as powerful as the Genesis or the Super Nintendo, but one of the most interesting things I found is how the games were distributed, and that's that instead of cartridges, these games would actually come on these little cards, and these were known as Hue cards. So inside this card, there's actually a little memory cell which actually stores all the data for the game, and then it connects to the system into this front port here. And these were the games. I mean, that's how small they were. I mean, they were almost the size of a credit card, and pretty incredible technology at the time that they could fit, you know, that kind of data for a full 16-bit game on these little cards. What's even more interesting is that the system was able to upgrade the RAM through these cards as well. So you'll see different system cards that go in here that expand the capabilities of the CD portion of the console, and it gives the system more RAM. And you'll actually see certain games that require a certain level of RAM to play, and that refers to the system card that you have to put into the front to play the games. The CD unit is a pretty rare console in the United States, and believe it or not, they didn't distribute this console in Europe. They looked at the sales numbers in the United States, and NEC decided to just not sell it in Europe. They didn't think it was as big of a success as it needed to be in the States to really warrant selling in Europe. That being said, the PC Engine was very successful in Japan.
Very successful.
And the game library on the Japanese side was significantly larger than the American library. You can have these systems modded to play the different regions. By default, the Turbografx is a region-locked system, so it can only play American games, but it is possible to mod them to play the Japanese games. Same thing with the PC Engine, you can have it modded to play the American games. That said, the CD unit is not region-locked, and you can also burn the CD games. So you don't need to have you can use any Turbografx, whether it's a PC Engine with the CD unit or Turbografx CD. You can play any game you want as long as you can burn the CD. There's no copy protection, there's no region lockout.
Oh, baby. And it's the best way to play one of the best Castlevania games that you can get your hands on, which is Dracula X Rondo of Blood, which is wonderful and very, very difficult.
And very expensive if you want to play the original version.
If you want to be legit. So that being said, the Turbografx 16 and the PC Engine and that whole family of consoles is very good for the fans of the arcade shooter, or a lot of great arcade ports on the Turbografx and the PC Engine. And if you love side-scrolling shooters or vertical shooters, it's a great console to have. And nowadays, since it's not the easiest or the cheapest or the least expensive to get your hands on a Turbografx 16 or a PC Engine with all the bells and whistles, the best way to probably play a lot of those games nowadays is trying to see if you can get yourself one of the Turbografx 16 or the PC Engine Minis, which probably retail for about $100, and they come with an HDMI output. You can put those right into a modern TV with very little issue. I have one myself, and I think it's amazing, and it comes loaded with games. It probably has one of the most robust libraries for a mini console out there, so that might be one of the best ways to play that one.
Yeah, and that was a big surprise when they announced that.
Yeah.
I really didn't think, since the Turbografx was kind of like the one of the more forgotten systems of this era, it was really great to see that they came out and did that and kind of celebrated this console, which really has developed a huge cult following, and this console has become far more beloved nowadays than it was back when it was new.
And now that Konami owns NEC, hopefully, Konami decides to produce more NEC content, or maybe do some more stuff with those licenses. Maybe we'll see more of this in the future. I would love to see more NEC stuff and Hudson Saw stuff. I would love to see more from the Turbografx and the PC Engine era. I feel like it's a part of this generation of gaming that kind of gets lost in the mix because there's so many consoles in Generation 4. As you can see, this table is littered with consoles and video games. So I think it's great that the Turbografx 16 or the PC Engine's finally getting its day. The Turbo 16 controller is interesting because it only has 2 buttons on the main controller. Later on, they would make a 6-button controller, and it actually has one of the best versions of Street Fighter 2 you can get, the PC Engine version. And
talk about the name Turbografx really comes from these switches here, which activate your turbo setting, and that allows you to just hold these buttons down
straight to rock and roll mode
and rapid fire. As Mike mentioned, there's a lot of shooting games on the Turbografx, and so instead of having to rapidly mash these buttons to fire, you can just hold these down, and then these would control the rate in which the turbo button fires.
I think it's actually imperative for most shooter games to have the turbo button on. I don't know if that makes me a bad gamer or a good gamer. All I know is that's how I have to play them.
Yep, I'm the same way. If I play a shoot 'em up where I can't do this or I can't hold the button down and it requires me to hit the button, I just turn it off because I know my thumb is just gonna like start to
it'll bleed eventually.
Fall off my hand and
no mashing.
No mashing. No mashing.
So do we want to go to the see? There's a lot of great consoles on this table, but I think the one we're going to talk about next might have the longest lasting impact.
You're not wrong.
You can't hide the fact that, like Brendan, like you said, this console does not get hidden in the mess of consoles, and we're going to talk about the Nintendo Game Boy. Something where, looking at it, this brick of a handheld console with a tiny green screen was able to completely dominate handheld gaming, and it kind of propelled Nintendo into the handheld space for essentially till now, right? For the last 30 some odd years.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a system that kind of kicked off pretty much an entire product line for Nintendo, right? Mm-hmm. A product line that they're pretty much still servicing today with the Nintendo Switch and being like a handheld game market, right? I mean, okay, there were toys and various LCD screen toys out there that were handheld games, but I don't think the market had really been defined as like the handheld market until the Game Boy.
No.
So video games, you can talk about like the first system to do this and the first system to do that, but like, let's be honest, the Game Boy created the handheld market. It became the standard of like the handheld market. It became the kind of like just the one to beat, pretty much.
And honestly, I think the term Game Boy has even been synonymous with handheld gaming essentially since the Game Boy had come out. And what's great about the Game Boy is that it kind of combines with the NES and the Famicom we're doing, and wanted to combine that with the portability of, say, the Game & Watch. And it's durable. I mean, there's a model Game Boy in the Nintendo store in New York City that had got hit with a bomb in the Iraq War in the 90s.
Yep.
And it's still playing Tetris, obviously. Tetris, the game for the Game Boy is Tetris. We can talk about Pokemon all you want, and I love Pokemon Red and Blue or Yellow, but Tetris everyone had a Game Boy with Tetris. And it's got a stereo output on the audio, so you hook some really nice stereo headphones up to that Game Boy and it sounds amazing. It's portable, it's durable, and it lasts for a very long time on just 4 AA batteries. Now, at the time, that was significant because its competitors had some real problems with battery life, whereas the Game Boy, like Nintendo's philosophy, it's technically inferior actually to most of the other handhelds that came out around the same time. However, its durability, its reliability, and its battery life is what made the Game Boy so special for a lot of gamers. A lot of us, we were kids at the time, so we couldn't buy batteries every 3 days to continue to fuel our Game Boy habits. And also it was cheap. I think it released at like $100 or maybe $150. So it was inexpensive and durable, and it had a great library of games.
Yeah, and like the Game Boy too, even the graphics for such a simple screen with only 2 colors, they got a lot of mileage out of those 2 colors. Like it was able to create some sprites that were interesting enough to be memorable. I mean, you know, if you look at Pokemon, like even those simple designs are still very, very memorable. And the fact that it was just the right amount of technology with portability. Mm-hmm. And I had a Game Boy as a kid, and I remember if you accidentally left home without it on a trip, and
Done.
it was, you know, like there was like a knot in your stomach, like, oh my God, what did what have I done?
What have I done?
You know, so.
You'd almost have to drive back home to get your hands on your Game Boy to take it on the trip, because you knew the trip was going to suck.
Yeah,
If you
it's
didn't have
akin
your
to
Game
like,
Boy
I mean,
with you.
nowadays if you left your house without your phone,
Yeah.
it's like that was what it felt like to leave the house without your Game Boy as a kid.
How am I going to play Super Mario Land
Yep.
on this trip if I don't have my Game Boy?
Yep. No, it was serious.
Really great, and the Game Boy had a lovely, long-lasting life. I think the Game Boy lasted until about 2000. So that console was about out and powerful for like 11 years.
Yep.
Granted, there were multiple iterations of the Game Boy when we got to Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color, and you name it. But however, it's all still the Game Boy. And while it's improvements upon the Game Boy hardware, it's still the Game Boy. It's still the same basic principle. So it's a really great console. I love the Game Boy.
Now, at the same time, Atari was trying to compete with the Game Boy and created their handheld console, which is known as the Atari Lynx.
Yeah, look at that thing.
Now, personally, I think the Lynx is an awesome system.
Cool.
I love the way it looks. I think it has a pretty nice color screen. It's the first handheld that has a color screen.
Yes.
It has, depending on the games you're playing, the graphics are pretty quite excellent. But the major drawback that the Lynx has over the Game Boy is that the battery life was just abysmal. I mean, the system just eats batteries. And as Mike was saying, the battery life that you got out of the Game Boy, even though the graphics were probably inferior to the Lynx, that alone was why the Game Boy kind of really won out. There was more games, there was better games, but also you could play longer. You weren't constantly feeding the thing batteries. On a technical level, you put the Lynx and the Game Boy next to each other, and I mean the Lynx, in my opinion, it looks cooler. The screen is bright colors, and you would think, well, this one's clearly better, right? Mm-hmm. But it really didn't matter that much back then. It was portability. I think we had a little bit more tolerance for convenience.
Yeah.
And it was convenient to have a system that didn't run out of batteries. There were way more games available for the Game Boy, and that's sort of been Nintendo's philosophy, right? They've never really put a tremendous amount of horsepower into their systems, but instead, you know, they're a little cheaper, they work better, there's more games available, there was better games available, and Nintendo's operating philosophy has kind of been the same to this day. I mean, you look at what Nintendo systems that are out today, and it's the same story. They're not the fastest, they're not the most expensive, they're not the most graphic intensive, but they work great, they're cheaper, they have an amazing library of games to play, and that's sort of why the Game Boy was able to beat the Lynx, and it's the same reason why Nintendo is competitive today.
Yeah, I haven't played too much Lynx, but I think it's cool. I think it's really remarkable that it's the first handheld device with a color screen. And you can also switch it, right? To switch or play lefty or righty. You could do some really wonky
the
stuff
Lynx
with that.
is a unique design.
Yeah.
This is actually the second generation of the Lynx console that we have here. There was an earlier version which was a little bit more elongated and less rounded on the edges. This version, though, I mean, you can flip this console over and you can see there's buttons on both sides, and it will allow you to kind of, if you're left-handed or right-handed, you can flip the system over and actually play with the buttons in a reverse configuration.
Yeah,
which
really
is
cool.
a very unique and interesting design, especially for the time.
And I believe this one is modded. You can mod this to output to a VGA. It looks like over here, so you could have that put on some sort of VGA monitor.
A lot of older consoles can actually be modded to output video to the TV, and this system here has actually been VGA modded, so you can play this Lynx on hooked up to a VGA monitor.
Which is really cool. And if you want to experience Lynx, this is probably the only way to do it right now is to get your hands on an Atari Lynx. Is it time?
It's time.
I've been like cradling this thing for the last 20 minutes. And
we've reached our favorite part of the program.
I usually lose my cool when I'm in the presence of a celebrity, but me and the CDI have gotten to know each other very well. So We're going to talk about the Philips CDI. As you might sense a little bit of sarcasm on my voice as I'm speaking about the Philips CDI, this console is not only the size of my car, it is also a very, very strange and unique console. I think there's something very lovely about it. I think it's a collector's dream to own one of these things. And it's got a very weird story. And it was produced by Philips, and Philips was looking to make a family center multimedia device. Am I right here? Like, look at it.
So let's just start with what CDI actually stands for, and it stands for Compact Disc Interactive.
Ooh.
And Philips really believed that the future of gaming was to create an interactive media device and run it off of a CD-ROM.
I mean,
which was a very good thought, because in a sense they were right. The issue that they ran into was that they created a machine that was trying to do too much at once and didn't really focus on whether or not it was a gaming machine or a movie playing device or some sort of computer peripheral, and it led to a lot of confusion as to why you would actually own this. It didn't fully appeal to gamers, it didn't fully appeal to multimedia people. At the time, it was a pretty interesting, new, unique product.
Yeah.
And really probably could have been successful, but had they focused on what it was really trying to do. But in the end, it was just trying to do too much at once.
It definitely felt like it was pulling itself in too many different directions instead of being something that was either, a multimedia device or a gaming device. And later on, obviously, the PlayStation would kind of learn from the mistakes of the CDI, which is hilarious when you think about the story of how everything panned out with the CDI. And I've played some CDI games, and yeah. So look at this controller. Okay, so this controller is the CDI control, like the handheld, the regular kind of controller that you would use for CDI. And it's got this thing in it, which is a removable joystick. So I say, just get rid of it. But really, it's got this removable joystick, and it's also got this very interesting touchpad style like remote control. And the games actually, you can play the games with this little analog stick here, which is also kind of remarkable at the time. The N64 hadn't come out yet, so there weren't really a lot of consoles that were using some sort of analog stick. And I think to me, the most significant aspect of the Philips CDI when it comes to the history of video games is the story between Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the PlayStation, Philips, the CDI. So Nintendo wanted to at some point make a CD add-on to the Super Nintendo, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. And they had entered some sort of deal, some sort of conversation with Sony to produce a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. And then at some point, those talks were still happening, but then Nintendo went and made a deal with Philips and let everyone know that they were working with Philips on a CD console, and Sony was not happy with Nintendo. And history, my friends, was made because at that point Nintendo was working with Philips, and as part of the deal, they licensed out some of their famous characters to CDI games. And those games are legendary. Legendarily legendary. Let's just go with that.
That's the nicest way of putting it.
We're going to keep it as very legendary. If you can get, first of all, they're incredibly expensive if you try to get your hands on them. There are, I think, 3 Zelda games.
There's 3 Zelda games, which are referred to as the Unholy Triforce.
Yep.
And then there's
a very, very...
And then there's this wonderful gem, which is known as Hotel Mario. And Mike and I have had some very interesting experiences with this game. When we have placed this CDI out to be played at in our free play area at the Long Island Retro Gaming Expo, we noticed that despite this game being much maligned and much made fun of, Hotel Mario gets played constantly.
Non-stop.
You cannot get people off of this game. Everybody is intrigued to try it, and they've heard about it, and they know that it's this obscure, weird, bad Mario game. And if I'm being perfectly honest, it's not a terrible game. It's just not a good Mario game. And
it's a fun puzzle game where you're slamming doors on people.
the other interesting thing that we've discovered is that compared to the Zelda games, which we have also put in during the Retro Gaming Expo, nobody plays those.
No.
Nobody plays the
wants
Zelda
them.
games. Nobody has any interest in playing the Zelda games. People might try it and get frustrated because they're just awful games and people just give up. This game is awful in the right ways, and people are willing to give it a chance and try to maneuver around its questionable controls, and it's just playable enough where you can get through a couple levels and you feel like you're getting somewhere. But this is also one of the few CDI games that I can legitimately say is a game. Most of the CDI games that came out were just sort of interactive encyclopedias, or like, click left and right on a full motion video at the right time so that your car turns at the right time, or you make the right decision at the right moment, or those kinds of things. There's not too many run and jump or shoot kind of games for the CDI because it was created as this interactive system, right? It was supposed to be a multimedia device, and it was. But like I said earlier, it just didn't really find its focus. The CDI is also capable of playing movies. There's an add-on digital video card that you can add to your CDI, which will let you play CDI formatted movies. It's sort of like an early format of DVDs, and kind of incredible that Philips was on the scene producing a device like this that could do that ahead of time. But again, everything just sort of got diluted. It was trying to do too much at once. But the CDI's lasting legacy really is its foray into gaming and licenses with Nintendo's intellectual property. That's sort of what we ended up with. The CDI came in various formats. This is the original CDI. Fortunately, the other formats are significantly smaller.
Oh, good.
But the mindset at the time was, in order for people to spend big money, objects of these kinds of devices were supposed to look high-tech. They were supposed to look big and robust. They were supposed to look like VCRs or stereo players. Philips wanted this to look like something that you'd put in your multimedia center. They didn't want it to look like a game console. They didn't want it to look like a toy in a way. They wanted it to look like a serious piece of hardware that would add to your family entertainment center and not just be another game console.
I think I had a 12-disc changer that was smaller than this thing.
Yeah.
Back in the day. I think this thing is gigantic, and it has a very special place in video game history, and I love it for that. I really do. And I love it for the FMVs that were included on all the Nintendo games, because
yes, the true lasting legacy are the full motion videos that are on these games, as well as the Zelda games. And if you haven't seen them, do yourself a favor and never ever watch them. I know you're probably Googling them immediately and are going to watch them now.
That's how you get people to do things. You tell them not to do it. I hope you brought a lot of spaghetti.
Hey, nice of the princess to invite us to a picnic, eh, Luigi?
Hey, why don't you show them the pinball game?
Oh yes, little personal anecdote. I brought along this game, which is called Pinball. And I'm a big pinball fan. I've played lots and lots of video pinball games, probably more than most people should or ever have. But I can tell you without question that this is the worst one ever. This is the worst pinball game that has ever been produced. I really can't explain exactly why. The graphics are just terrible. The flippers hang in awkward position. It gets boring after about 2 minutes. It's almost as if like a high school student was just like learning how to program and decided to make a pinball game, and Philips was like, oh great, print it, make a game.
Oh, no.
And that's what they did. Yeah, like I said, I've played a lot of video pinball.
Yes, you have.
And I can, without question, I don't even think I can think of a runner-up. This is the worst pinball game ever made. And if you have one that's worse, I'd like to try it, but it's going to be hard to beat this one.
Yeah, send us a message. So moving through 1991, we're going to get to the first, I think, true competitor to the Game Boy, and it kind of got its lunch eaten. But Sega Game Gear, which you can see right over here as I stretch to get this thing off the table, the Sega Game Gear was Sega's attempt at creating a portable console. Now, this was essentially like a Master System on the go, right?
That's exactly what it was.
Yes. A lot of the same games.
Sega was able to take the Master System technology and put it into a little handheld. And they did. And listen, I had a Game Gear as a kid, and I thought it was a great system. The really interesting thing that Sega did was they were able to take a lot of their hit games from the Genesis and sort of piggyback off of that success and ride it into the Game Gear. So you had Sonic games. There was even a Dynamite Heady port. You had games like Ristar and that sort of thing. So the games were there. The Game Gear was good enough to play them. I mean, obviously we weren't dealing with Sega Genesis level graphics or speed, but they pulled it off. And I think the Game Gear certainly wasn't as successful as the Game Boy, but I think it's something that is remembered fondly, and people really do remember the Game Gear, and a lot of people had Game Gears where I can tell you, I don't know anybody that had an Atari Lynx back in the day, but I know many people that had the Game Gear and are very nostalgic about the Game Gear.
I mean, it had a color screen, right? And it was it was frontlit or backlit?
It is backlit.
It's backlit.
It's a backlit screen. So Game Gear did run into the issue of the battery problem.
And that's the problem.
Not as bad as the Lynx. The Lynx is notoriously awful on batteries. The Game Gear was definitely better. And as a kid, I used to play the Game Gear at home, and it did come, and all these handheld systems came with an AC adapter where if you were at home, you could just plug it in. Yeah, that's how I played the Game Gear a lot.
But it would run on 6 AA batteries and have about 3 to 4 hours of battery life. So when you're talking about the Game Boy, which could probably run, 10 hours on about 4 AA's, you're talking, that's a big jump. Also, the Game Gear was, from what I remember, more expensive, but it did have that nice color screen, and it gave you a Master System on the go. A lot of those games even ended up, like some of the Sonic games even ended up on the Master System. So it's an interesting piece of hardware, and I really like it, and I love that Sega was trying to do something in the handheld space at this time period, because it seemed like that was when handheld was really first trying to take off. Right.
One unfortunate thing about the Game Gear is that they haven't aged particularly well, and if you find a Game Gear, more than likely it's going to need some capacitor repair. If you pick up a Game Gear and the audio is dead, it's usually a sign that the system is dying and needs to be repaired. They are all fixable. They're usually not damaged beyond repair, but most Game Gears that I've encountered have had issues, and they need to be serviced. Which I can't say for a lot of other consoles that kind of lasted longer. Like the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, for example, very rarely have I encountered those systems needing to be repaired. They do have issues, but the Game Gear, unfortunately, has had a lot of issues since it's just old and the way it was built.
Sega is releasing a very small version of the Game Gear soon.
Oh, that's right, the Game Gear Mini
Game
just
Gear
got
Mini,
announced,
which comes out in a array of colors with all different games preloaded onto it. I think each of them has 5 different games preloaded onto it, so that should be something to get excited about in the near future, especially if you're a fan of the Game Gear.
That thing looks really small too. I mean, we're talking about like the palm of your hand. I really just want to see it in person to see how small it is, because like, I mean, you're talking about it being almost the size of the Game Gear screen. It looks that small. So I can't imagine like actually playing something on it, but I guess we'll see.
I'll buy one for the novelty factor. So what I love most about Generation 4 is, like, look at this table, right? It's filled with consoles, and there were so many consoles coming out. And it was finally starting to get to a point where console makers like Sega here were trying to bring the arcade experience home. And what's the best way to do that other than bringing your literal arcade machine or your arcade hardware into consoleizing it and bringing it into the home? And that's when we're going to talk about the Neo Geo Aes.
Yeah, the Neo Geo, we don't have one here, but essentially what Mike said is Neo Geo said, hey, why don't we just take our arcade hardware and make a home console out of it and not change it? And that's what they did. And the Neo Geo Aes ended up being one of the most expensive consoles that was available for that reason. So the Neo Geo Aes would cost you $650 for the console and then $250 per game.
That's incredible.
So you're talking about a cost for the console that a cost per game that was more than the other consoles that were available at the time. But Neo Geo marketed it as the only arcade perfect hardware that was out there. So when you walked into an arcade and played a Neo Geo, and you walked home and played your Neo Geo AES,
same thing.
You were playing the exact same graphics, the exact same sound, with only slight modifications to the games. But other than that, you were playing the exact replica at home, and it really became sort of like the Mercedes-Benz of video game consoles. I don't know a single person that had a Neo Geo AES growing up. I guess I just didn't have rich friends.
It's a very expensive console. It's great, but it's still very expensive, and the games are still quite expensive. So it's one of those luxury video game items that some people are very fortunate to have in their collection, but it's a really great, cool console. I love that it just brought the arcade experience home. And as someone who loves arcade games, especially arcade fighting games and side-scrolling beat-em-ups, it's like you couldn't beat it for that. And I love the Neo Geo. I haven't had enough experience with it, but I do very much love it.
Yeah, I think the Neo Geo, if you look at the graphics capabilities, you're talking about a system that came out in 1989 and wasn't retired until about 2003 or 2004, I believe. So one of the longest lifespans of any console, because they really put everything they had into it. I mean, it really was built to last. And the Neo Geo arcade games are still some of the best arcade games to this day.
Ever.
And nowadays, you can play a lot of Neo Geo games on the Nintendo Switch. You can
with arcade arcades.
You can purchase them on the eShop. There is a Neo Geo Classic Console, a desktop system. There have been various anniversary editions of the Neo Geo, all sorts of different things. The Neo Geo has definitely become a truly beloved and well-collected system, but at the time, it was just so expensive that, like I said, I not only do I not remember seeing anyone that owned one, but I don't even really remember seeing them for sale in a lot of stores.
No,
I don't think stores carried it because of the price,
anything.
and they knew that people weren't paying that amount for games. But I really don't remember even seeing it back then.
Yeah, no, it was a great little console, or a great large console rather, in terms of price point. But I think we have to go now to my favorite console of all time. I'm going to probably wax a little poetic about this gray and purple little guy over here, but my life would not be the same without the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo was Nintendo's fourth generation console, their second home console, really. After the NES, it was the follow-up to the NES and with the Super Nintendo, and that came out in 1991. And I can't say enough good about this thing.
It's hard to even figure out where to start.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's hard.
I think the most people our age, you ask them what their favorite console is, I would say 9 times out of 10 people respond with the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, it ended up winning the console war we were talking about before between the Genesis, and while it started out kind of behind the Genesis, and the Genesis was beating it for most of the generation, a little game called Donkey Kong Country helped push Nintendo and the SNES forward with its modern graphics. And what Nintendo was doing with the Super Nintendo was a direct shift from what Sega was trying to do with the Genesis, where Sega was trying to make fast and loud and arcade-style experiences for the home. The Super Nintendo was trying to give you something that was uniquely a home console game. If you look back at the Super Nintendo's library, the genres that really stood out were platformers, RPGs, long games that were slower, and they were more methodical, more thought about, more story-driven. And that's not saying the Super Nintendo is better than the Genesis for that reason. I'm just saying it was a totally different way to go about things. They wanted to give you something that you could only really experience at home. I'm not going to go to an arcade and play 30 hours of Final Fantasy because you can't. So that's kind of where the Super Nintendo really hit its bread and butter. I mean, I think SNES and 16-bit era RPGs, while the Genesis has some great ones for sure, that's the console you're going to buy. I can name the top 20 games in the Super Nintendo, and it'll probably give you 20 of the top, 20 top games of all time based on the library. And the library is excellent. It's a 16-bit console. It Oh, and it also had some really great options with the cartridges. Now, the cartridges were expensive. For some of you who remember, I remember shelling out, well, I didn't probably shell out, my parents probably did, but I remember shelling out sometimes $60, $70, $80 for a cartridge, especially when you're talking about something like Street Fighter II or Donkey Kong Country or Yoshi's Island, stuff that used they changed up the chips and the carts inside the cartridge. They would change up the chips to give more power, because if the system didn't have enough power to run something, they would do it through the FX chip that they would put in the game.
Yeah, I always thought that was something I discovered later, as I continued learning about retro gaming and stuff, and I wasn't really aware back then that's how they were doing it. It's like, why do games that came out later in the lifespan of the Super Nintendo look better or have more capabilities than the earlier games? It's that they were actually putting additional hardware and processing hardware on the games themselves to handle certain 3D tasks or advanced graphics things that the Super Nintendo couldn't do by itself. I thought that was so interesting, and it's really one of those things that's unique to kind of like the cartridge form of media that you really don't get with CD-based games or anything like that, because CD, you're limited strictly to what you can do software-wise. Yeah. With cartridges, you were able to say, hey, we need an extra chip. We need an extra processing chip that the system doesn't have. Yeah. Well, guess what? We can just put it in the cartridge. More expensive for the manufacturers to make, but they were still able to do those upgrades on like a per game basis, which is really something that's just truly unique to cartridge gaming. But I agree. I mean, the Super Nintendo has some of the greatest games of all time. We have Super Metroid in here, which is probably my favorite video game of all time.
I think it's easily in the top 5.
And a lot of people do consider it one of the best games ever made.
Especially now with how indie games have gone, and how 1 out of every, 3 indie games is a Super Metroid clone to some degree. Yep. I think its significance has lasted way now. It has grown into the future and has become one of the most influential video games of all time. And what I always like to point out about the Super Nintendo is look at the controller. Now, in Japan, there was the Super Famicom, which had a different color palette. It had 4 different colors: red and green and yellow and blue. Yeah,
the branding of the systems was slightly different. In America, they went with this gray and purple, and in Japan, they kind of went with like more of a rainbow look. But the controller overall was the same design in terms of the button layout. And one of the most revolutionary things that was introduced were these shoulder buttons, which we've seen every console since then have had shoulder buttons, sometimes multiple shoulder buttons.
Yeah.
And
even Nintendo now has multiple shoulder buttons. Yes. And what I love about the American version of the Super Nintendo is these scalloped or these concave top buttons. For some reason, it's always felt right to me to have these buttons this way, and that's only on the American version of the SNES. The Super Famicom does not have that. All the buttons are the same. So I actually really dig the blue, the gray and purple look. One of the issues you run into with the Super Nintendo is that the bottom of it sometimes can get yellowed, but nowadays we have the ability to clean that and get it back to its beautiful gray state.
We also have some modern conveniences when it comes to the Super Nintendo, and that's if you don't want to find one of the original systems, you can go ahead and get one of these, the Super Nintendo Classic Edition, which fits in the palm of your hand.
Whoa.
And this is like some of the other mini consoles that we've discussed, the Sega Genesis Mini and the Turbografx Mini. This is very similar in that you have an HDMI out, so you can connect this to modern televisions. They've retained the exact same controller design, which is really cool that Nintendo really kind of went above and beyond to kind of match the quality, if not improve the quality of the original.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of a modern way to play Super Nintendo games. You can also play a lot of these games on the Switch. If you have online internet access for your Switch, you can play a lot of Super Nintendo games for free. They give you a free app that has a whole bunch of games that they just let you play. I think Nintendo is definitely aware that their audience is very, very much connected to this system and still wants to play these games. And a lot of Nintendo's key franchises, I think, even if they had appeared first on the NES or the Game Boy, really kind of solidified their place. some of the best Kirby games, some of the best Metroid games, Donkey Kong Country, Mario Kart was started on the Super Nintendo. So you're talking about a lot of like key franchises that really kind of put their stake in the ground with the Super Nintendo, and every Nintendo console since has had at least one major game in those franchises, put out on a console.
Yeah, pretty much.
It all really started with this.
And pretty much, everyone from Smash Brothers everyone from like the original Smash Brothers games makes an appearance on the Super Nintendo. What's also very interesting about this is that at that time, like we said before, Nintendo was working with Sony to possibly design a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. Obviously, that deal had fallen through, and it was originally going to be called the Nintendo PlayStation. However, we know what happened, and Sony broke away from Nintendo in that aspect and made their own PlayStation, which they'll talk about in Gen 5.
Yep.
But this is a great console. I love the Super Nintendo. It's the Super Nintendo and the Genesis are the perfect complement to one another to experience so much of what gaming was trying to do at that time. And my favorite video game of all time is on the Super Nintendo, and that's Super Mario RPG. So.
Pretty good choice.
Yeah.
Pretty good choice. I can't fault you there. One of my favorites as well.
So, all right, so we talked about the Super Nintendo. Now we have to talk about a lot of Sega stuff.
Yeah, so Sega kind of realized that the Super Nintendo was starting to really fight back against what Sega was doing, and the Genesis was sort of winning that console war in the 16-bit era for a little while, and then as the Super Nintendo started gaining popularity and putting out some incredible games, Sega tried to do a couple things to kind of revamp the Genesis and keep the Genesis alive. The first thing that Sega did was they released the Sega Cd, which is a CD add-on peripheral that connects to your Genesis.
This is the sidecar model.
And gives it the enhanced capability to run games off of CD-ROM, as well as some additional RAM and some new features, new colors, new sound capabilities that the regular Genesis didn't have by itself. The Sega CD, I would say, was probably not as successful as what Sega would have hoped, but it also wasn't a complete failure. It does have some pretty memorable games, including Sonic CD, which I think is the best Sonic game that's ever been put out. A lot of people argue with me on that, but I don't know. I can't get over Sonic CD. I think it's just one of the most beautiful games that they put out back then.
It also had Kojima's follow-up to the Metal Gear franchise at the time called Snatcher, which was kind of like Blade Runner meets Terminator, and it is a lovely adventure game that is really, really expensive to get your hands on now.
Yes. Luckily, that is a game you can burn. You can burn a copy of it and play it, and I would recommend that you do. Snatcher is an awesome game, and probably one of the best Sega CD games out there.
Absolutely say so. And Sega got really into add-ons for the Genesis. It's kind of like you were trying to make a, like I said before, you're trying to make a Genesis Voltron here. We have most of it in our hands right now. We have the regular Sega Genesis, Sega CD sidecar model, and then we have the 32X, which was something you would put in the cartridge slot for the Sega Genesis, and it was a kind of a mini console on its own.
So the 32X really was born out of kind of like a lot of like internal compromises at Sega. The video game industry was very quickly going towards 3D gaming. Everybody wanted 3D games. The Sony PlayStation was on its way out, and a lot of arcade games, especially Sega's arcade games at the time, were coming out with 3D graphics, and there was kind of a demand for 3D. Sega felt that their next system, the Sega Saturn, wasn't going to be out quick enough, and that they needed to push something out to kind of give the Sega Genesis like one last push. And their idea came in the form of the 32X, which was just another tumorous add-on to throw on top of your Genesis and give it some more enhanced graphics capabilities that added a few more sound channels. And the 32X is not necessarily a bad thing, it just wasn't really worth the money, and really wasn't worth the effort on Sega's part. They really should have just put all their effort and marketing and time and energy into pushing the Sega Saturn rather than dealing with this thing. It really is just an unnecessary console. It's not something that sold a lot. It wasn't something that sold a lot of games. There weren't a lot of games made for it. That being said, there are a couple of decent titles. Knuckles Chaotix, Tempo is one of my favorites. I was one of the weird kids that had a 32X as a child, and my brother and I, we thought it was really cool. We thought it was like the next logical thing. If you were a Sega kid, you had to have one, and we had a Sega Cd and we had a 32X, and we thought it was really cool. But I can tell you that we only ever bought 4 games for it, because there wasn't a lot to choose from, and the 4 games that we had, you know, we had fun with them, but it was just sort of, it came out at a weird time and just didn't really seem necessary to buy more games for it.
And when you're only a year out from the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn, it's kind of hard to throw in something there that's really not a full jump.
Yeah, and people knew that those consoles were coming out and didn't feel the need to spend the money on this when they could just be saving it up for the newer systems and buy, you know, more games with that money.
They came out a year later, so this wraps us up for the end of Generation 4, and it was a doozy.
Well, wait, we forgot one. We forgot the Sega Nomad, which is basically just a Sega Genesis in portable form. So, like the Game Gear was a portable version of the Sega Master System, the Nomad was capable of playing 16-bit Sega Genesis cartridges. So similar philosophy, just a different product, and again, another thing that Sega was doing. Sega was not shy from creating new hardware at the time. At a time where Nintendo was pretty much solely focused on the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy, you had Sega that came out with the Sega Cd, the 32X, the Game Gear, and the Nomad.
Yeah.
All at the same time.
Too many product streams, yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot. And Sega would eventually focus in.
And that I think wraps us up.
Yes, so that wraps us up for Generation 4, and that was a doozy. Wow, that's a lot of consoles.
Got through everything.
Whew, I'm out of breath. Are you out of breath?
That was my whole childhood. Just went, like right, that was it.
And I just relived all of the 90s, or at least all of the early 90s. So
the good part of the 90s.
The good. So I hope you have fun with all the other generations, but thank you for watching UPLINK.
Yes, and
TV.
we'll see you when we go over Generation 5 consoles.